David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his contribution and also the officials from the Reserve Bank who have briefed other parties, including the Labour Party. They were fulsome in their briefings and answered all of the questions we could think of to ask at the time. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party will be supporting the first reading of this bill to Select Committee. We recognise that the issue of covered bonds has become normal internationally. I think the Minister put the issue quite properly when he said that there is effectively a trade-off here between obtaining long-term sources of funds that can be cheaper and also longer in the term of lending to the New Zealand bank, and that is a good thing. On the other hand, there's a tension in that the creditor who has recourse through these special purpose vehicles to a group of securities held by the bank through a special purpose vehicle is effectively getting a secured interest in those particular assets that ranks ahead of unsecured depositors in the bank. And in practical terms, what that means is that the largely overseas lender lending to a New Zealand bank through a special purpose vehicle using covered bonds will have a preferential position in the queue should the bank go bust, to the detriment of unsecured deposit holders. Now, the trade-off that is to the benefit of the unsecured deposit holder in New Zealand is that it's less likely that the bank will go bung because they have access to covered bond markets that are deep in liquidity and cheaper in cost. So the balance between those two objectives is sought to be achieved by this bill, setting up a regulatory regime and putting a limit on the amount that can be issued by way of covered bonds which have this preferential security status compared with unsecured depositors. The advice that we were given by the Reserve Bank, both in their briefing to us as a party and also in the financial stability hearing that pursuant to which the Governor of the Reserve Bank was before the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, the advice that we had on both of those occasions is that currently, before this practice of covered bonds became more widespread, there was very little secured lending to banks, and all lending, or close to all lending, was unsecured, which would mean that on a bank going bust, everyone has a scrap, but everyone's effectively got a pro rata right to a share of the asset, and no significant secured creditors would have a right of access to the bank's assets upon liquidation in preference to unsecured creditors. So this is a significant change in recent years. The New Zealand banks starting to dip their toe in the water when it comes to obtaining long-term funding through covered bond markets overseas. There's a couple of other points I'd like to make, sir. One is, one of the reasons why this might be more important to New Zealand banks than it might be to certain other overseas banks is that sadly in New Zealand over the last 3 decades we've witnessed a decrease in the proportion of our financial institutions that are both owned in New Zealand and actually financed in New Zealand. We've run a current account deficit for so long in New Zealand that we have lost ownership of a lot of our financial sector. And that points to some fundamental problems in the New Zealand economy that this bill is not going to fix, but that make this bill more necessary until it is fixed. The truth of the matter is that New Zealand has run a current account deficit for 4 decades. The level of that current account deficit has been more than additional capital investment in New Zealand. It's actually paid for consumption. And the current account deficit that we have when the value of our exports is not enough to cover the cost of our imports, and our interest bill is every year paid for by a combination of selling New Zealand assets that were previously New Zealand owned to foreign buyers and borrowing more money from overseas. So those are the 2 ways that normally a current account deficit is financed. And now that we've done that for 4 decades, growth, sorry? Well, you can develop that point, but essentially when we have a current account deficit and we're not covering the cost of our imports and exports, then we have a problem. And I don't think there's really many people would disagree with that. You know, New Zealand now has got one of the highest rate of net international liability in the world. And indeed, there's, you know, the countries that are as bad as us are a short list, and they're actually not good company. They're Iceland, Hungary, Ireland, Greece and Portugal. I think they're the only countries that have a worse net international liability position than New Zealand. That makes us very reliant on foreign credit lines into our banks, and makes us vulnerable to credit squeezes in a way that we wouldn't be if we had greater pools of savings in New Zealand rather than reliant on overseas loans to New Zealand and overseas ownership of New Zealand assets. So that background, sir, is something that should be highlighted here, because it's that level of international indebtedness, our net international liabilities to the rest of the world, which makes New Zealand banks more reliant on overseas credit lines, and therefore more likely to be needing to access these longer term deposits from overseas investors into New Zealand, who will have advantage of these covered bonds, which have some benefits to the New Zealand banking system, and therefore also to unsecured depositors of New Zealand banks. So, Mr. Speaker, I think for me, one of the issues that we'll be looking at finance and expenditure from the Labor side is whether the limit on the amount that can be secured by a bank ahead of unsecured creditors should be set out in the statute, or whether it should be left to Reserve Bank guidance. I don't know the answer to that offhand, and I'm sure we'll get advice from the Reserve Bank, and I'm not sure what other officials would be advising that committee, but I do wonder whether there should be some statutory limit to the amount which can be the subject of these covered bonds, which rank ahead of unsecured creditors. That's one of the issues that we can discuss at Select Committee. But the more important issue for me is that we must take steps in New Zealand to redress this imbalance that we have in our economy, where we don't earn enough from our exports to pay for our imports and interest. And we must address that through improvements to our savings, through some improvements to our tax system to encourage export growth rather than the growth of the speculative parts of our economy, as well as some other measures like research and development tax credit, and addressing some of the fiscal pressures that are coming at us through the ageing population and some of the unrealistic settings that we have around our age of entitlement to superannuation. And those are some of the big issues that need to be tackled by government. Only governments can change those measures, just like only governments can put in place this measure effectively. Businesses can't do it for themselves, and it's incumbent upon this Parliament to actually look at what is the cause of the loss of ownership of our financial sector over the last 2 or 3 years, which is now largely Australian owned. It's no coincidence that they've got better savings, a better tax system. They tax capital gains and remove the tax bias that favours speculative investment. And as a consequence, beg your pardon? Oh, I'm not saying that property prices don't go up. No one suggested that, Mr. Goldsmith, but there's no doubt that the net international liability position of Australia is better than the net international liability position of New Zealand.
$1 trillion in industry savings.
$1 trillion in industry savings is the figure that my colleague tells me. That makes a difference. Mr. Speaker, in closing, the Labor Party supports this to Select Committee, but we are interested as to whether the appropriate limit on these covered bonds is 10% and whether it should be enshrined in statute. Thank you.
I call Todd McLeay.
Speaker, thank you. It's a pleasure to rise and speak on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand covered bonds.